I've read, there we go. I've navigated a few hundred, I've read a few hundred different ordinances. I'm not sure that I'm really the expert in this topic in that how to develop an ordinance or um, sort of the details of it. But because I have such a breadth, I'm hoping that I can sort of start a little bit of a conversation with you all and help tree keepers of Washington County continue to do their work and maybe even a little more effectively in trying to understand a little breadth of how I see tree ordinances. So in thinking about how to get started here, I thought that I would just mention that Will's presentation after the storms in January of 2024 was amazing. And that he really outlined um, two different layers of tree loss that we experienced during a big storm, where hundreds of trees failed across the sort of greater Portland area. But then, even more sort of alarming was that people would be really scared of their trees and start removing healthy trees because they started seeing them as threats, and that was something that he was, I think, did a pretty good job of hopefully calming people down a little bit about, of saying, hey, we should, really slow down and think about, do we want to remove some of these bigger healthy trees? And that it was a little bit, um, he warned us all that in Washington County, because the laws were different than they are here in Portland, I'm coming from Portland today, that meant that you sort of the responsibility was more on you all to be responsible homeowners in getting trees assessed and trying to make good, difficult decisions. So I thought I'd talk a little bit more about this storm and just that when you look at the Oregon Department of Emergency Management, I saw an estimate of $165 million in damages. And that while the storm hit sort of all across the state, the real concentration of damage was right where Multnomah and Clackamas and Washington County all come together, sort of this area that we're focused on a little bit today. And that it was interesting. So I went and did some risk assessments. I did some post-storm inspections to try to help people figure out if their trees were healthy, whether they needed to come out. And when I would go to a place with, big trees that were potentially a concern in Washington County, unincorporated Washington County, we would have I noticed we had somewhat of a different conversation about, hey, what do you want to do with the tree? What does this tree mean to you? Than when we were in Portland, when I would have to say things like, hey, what do we think we could get legally approved from the city or something like that? And so how we have these conversations were inherently different based on the ordinances of where these trees were located, even though these two properties, these two locations were like less than a mile apart. It seemed a little bit crazy to me that because of these jurisdictional boundaries, I was having such different conversations with these clients. But I'm also totally accustomed to that because most of my work is in development, and that I'm very accustomed to when we are digging near trees, when we are creating tree protection plans, when we're doing things like that. We really focus on the individual ordinances and that the laws and legal protections of these trees vary so much from city to city to city that just moving, a couple of blocks over and having to take a totally different approach to how we might do tree preservation. I follow the best management practices. I sort of do things in my own way, the way that I was trained to be a consulting arborist, but that largely what it says to do in the best management practices, how I was trained, is that we're trying to focus and follow these local ordinances and trying to make sure that everything is done in those ways, as well as the best management practice, as well as what we think is best and things like that. But that's very central to a lot of the work that I do. And I wanted to sort of express, first of all, how unique I think this is. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Clean Water Act are federal laws, right? Our birds are protected at this federal level. Our waters are protected mostly at this federal level. And hunting regulations and protection for mammals are generally at the state level. Each state sort of decides how to do that. I have a pesticide consultant license from the state of Oregon. How we use pesticides and herbicides and insecticides is not regulated at the local level, it's regulated at the state level. And trees are pretty unique in how many different laws there are and how widely these sort of vary from region to region to region. And today, when we talk about trees, it gets a little confusing as to what exactly is the urban forest. I'm going to say that I'm focused on the urban forest. I know that I end up working in quite a few places that look like this, but this is not sort of our focus today. There's sort of a blurry line between what are natural areas, what are traditional forestry, and what is urban forestry. And so largely we're talking today about trees in cities, and they can look pretty rural, pretty, natural, but that I'm thinking mostly about these trees that are sort of single trees planted by somebody, managed by somebody, but we'll appreciate that there's some gray area there. And how I answer questions and how we sort of have this discussion may change a little bit depending on what exactly we're thinking of. When we say the urban forest, are we thinking about this thing on the left or this thing on the right or something more in between? So in thinking about how trees are regulated, I think somewhat through permitting of you need to get a permit to do something pretty often here. And the first question about do you need a permit, which permit do you need, is about what are you doing? Are you out there planning on removing a tree? This is sort of the one that I'm most involved with most often. I think most often requires a permit. We compare that to pruning. Sometimes, in some situations, you're required to get a permit in order to prune trees. And then sometimes, in some situations, you're required to get a permit to plant a tree. And then a whole variety of other activities. Like I said earlier, we could be treating with insecticides, we could be doing other things, but the what of what we're doing is maybe the first thing to think about in trying to decide whether or not these trees are protected, whether or not our local ordinances are regulating these trees. Probably just as important, maybe more important, is where is this tree? Is this tree growing in private property, like in your front yard or your backyard or your client's front yard or backyard? Is it growing as a street tree, meaning that it's growing within the public right-of-way? And sort of who manages that and how does each city's sort of relationship with their right-of-way changes a little bit? And then park trees or natural area trees or other areas that are on public property. Each one of these could be impacted by one of our projects, could need to be managed, and we might need to get different approval by different entities to work in this. We could include in this like sensitive habitat zones or riparian areas or other things that I don't even have on this list because I'm trying to focus a little more urbanly here. Then the next question is, why are we doing what we're doing? Which is, is it a risk problem? Are we removing it because it's a dead tree? Are we removing it for some reason like that? Do we need to prune it for clearance, or we're removing it because it's growing too big for the space or something along those lines? Or are we coming in to do construction and that the tree is going to need to be pruned or removed in order to do this new construction? And so I think once we've thought about these three items of what, where, and why, that really determines whether or not we're going to need a permit, whether or not our tree is protected by this particular ordinance, and sort of how it's going to be regulated. I'm going to take a quick pause here. I'm going to pause periodically to let Laurette potentially ask a question or do different things, but also because I need a drink of water, and I've been told pauses are important for presentations. What's up, Fran?
I've been monitoring the chat so far. I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, I just raised my hand. So in Washington County, so we have three things going on in Washington County. Clearly, we have the emerald ash borer, which reflects what you're talking about on the left. And that is being managed in terms of what we do where by the Washington County and the Oregon Department of Forestry and various other agencies. Yeah. The things that have been really rubbing some of us raw is this middle picture. We've been having, the commissioners have been deciding to widen roads, widen sidewalks, and take down perfectly healthy trees. Also, in the case of where the tree roots may affect the infrastructure, rather than repairing the infrastructure the way that Portland does, Washington County has opted to cut the trees down and plant saplings. And then we have the situation on the right. So I've lived on Cooper Mountain for 40 years. We didn't have any sidewalks. We didn't have any of this. I didn't know things like an HOA is accountable for taking care of the street trees. I had no idea. And so that's why when you go into an underserved community, a lower income community, you won't see street trees or vegetation on the sidewalk, planter strips or whatever, because they can't afford to either maintain them. They can't afford the insurance on the trees. And so we have these different problems here in Washington County. And we're hoping that you can give us some ideas, for instance, about what we need to do to change some of these behaviors from our people to understand it better, and then getting kind of mobilize the community to help educate our commissioners who are condoning these practices.
Yeah, let's have more of that discussion as we go along here, Fran. I think that every community is experiencing every one of these problems. And there's a lot of difficult decisions to be made out there. And those, we can disagree with those decisions a lot. That often I'm sort of on the side of I'm there making the difficult decisions with people. So I have a lot of compassion for understanding that they're doing their best to make difficult decisions, but absolutely there's opportunities to improve all over the place, everywhere that we are. And let's get into some of the specifics. And that brings up a good point too of this is only a 45-minute presentation. We have an hour and a half blocked off here. Start writing some questions in the chat. Start thinking about what you want to talk about. Start thinking about questions to ask once we're done here. But at this point, I think we'll ask the question of like, maybe in this audience, we don't need to ask this question at all, but maybe why protect these trees at all? Why is this an important issue, right? And so I really like this graphic here. It comes from California Relief, this little one-page handout that they have, talking about all of the ways that trees are important in terms of our health, both getting us outside, cleaning the air that we breathe, a little less pollution, saving us energy, and especially reducing some extreme heats. Improving our water quality is a huge one here in Oregon. I think this mental health one is an interesting one that more and more data are coming out all the time. And increasing value is one that I don't harp on too much. And most of my trees that I have in my yard produce food. I have pears, I have grapes, I have all sorts of things in my yard. So that's one that I like a lot. Now, while this is like super general, I'm going to try to hone in on a couple of these that I think both are super important and hyper local, just to show some examples from some Pacific Northwest where we have real data, real things that we could rely on and show people should they be interested in more of this. And so the first one's about heat, where Dr. Vivek Chandras does amazing work. And this paper that came out, I think about 10 years ago now, was sort of revolutionary in telling us about urban heat island effect and redlining and all sorts of different things and how it comes together. That where we have the most heat in our cities is where we have the least canopy coverage. And the reason that we have the least canopy coverage is because those were ignored parts of the city where we weren't planting trees or investing into those resources, and that we can still see those effects today. And so when we look at the heat dome that happened a couple of years ago and where people died in the city, tragically, 80 people died throughout Portland, and that the areas that people died in matches up almost perfectly with the canopy coverage throughout the city, and that Dr. Chandras and others almost perfectly predicted that this is what was going to happen because they had done that study over all of these different cities and saw, oh, when a heat wave hit Atlanta, this is what happened. When a heat wave hit here, this is what happened. And here in Portland, we have as much of a canopy inequity issue as anywhere, and that extends beyond Portland to the Washington County and other regions as well. A professor, a researcher up in Washington has been looking at doing sort of literature reviews and meta-analyses of the sort of health benefits of trees and other green spaces, and has tied it to things like newborn health, attention deficit disorder, school performance, crime, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, all over the place. And so we can really see that trees are really making a big impact in our communities. And that if we hone in on cardiovascular disease right here, that's sort of the biggest number on this chart. And what we'll do is we'll look at another paper published by Dr. Donovan, US Forest Service up in Washington again, who partnered with Friends of Trees and looked at where they planted trees across 30 years all over the city of Portland, and came up with these mind-boggling numbers of, we estimated that planting a tree in each of Portland's 140 census tracts would generate $14 million in annual benefits. So $14 million a year from just planting 140 trees. And this is mostly tied to cardiovascular disease and keeping people alive, right? Of like the life expectancy change based on just planting 140 trees. Does Mary Lou want to jump in right here and say something? Is that what that hand raise means? Do you want to be politely brought up some other time? Go on.
I just wasn't sure that you were aware that we have no tree protection in unincorporated Washington County.
You can trust that I will get to that. We're building.
Okay, because we don't, that's our problem, is that there are no ordinances or codes or anything that protect our trees.
Agreed.
There's no permitting needed, in other words, if somebody wants to chop down a tree.
Sure. I believe the audience here is not just unincorporated Washington County. We're trying to give a little bit of breadth beyond that, but we'll get there for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, also, I've been working on the urban heat islands, work with Professor Sandus, and I was one of the people that did the heat watch last year. So if anyone has any questions about that, we Tree Keepers has been doing GIS maps, etc., to map that as well. So we can support all of this information.
Have you yourself been driving around in the car with the little thermometer on?
Yep. I still have the sticker on my car. But yeah, so we actually have specifics, and when we do the cool schools, we're looking at that same item. So it's a very important topic, the heat islands.
Absolutely. And so how do ordinances come about? And what I would say is they come about because the community demands it. So here, I just show as an example, we have a post from Trees for Life, who I believe that Tree Keepers of Washington County, I was pitched Tree Keepers of Washington County were the Trees for Life of Washington County. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm bringing it up here, where we have a very ugly picture of 82nd Avenue in Portland, and basically saying, hey, we need more healthy tree canopy in these areas for the people living, walking, working, waiting at the bus stops. All of these things, we need some larger trees in these areas to try to bring some environmental and health benefits. And just 3 days ago, Keybot put on their Instagram that they're working on 82nd Avenue, bringing accessible curb ramps, high visibility crosswalks, and concrete median islands with trees and other vegetation. So this work is happening here. I believe last I saw, they're in a 3-mile stretch. They're going to add 182 trees along one of the streets in Portland that most needs it. And so community activism is really important in trying to create these ordinances and trying to figure out the right way for your community to protect trees in the ways that your community really needs. And so Friends of Trees is another great nonprofit doing this sort of work. Here they are going out on a little tour where they're talking and looking at not just the mature trees here, but also the young trees recently planted by Friends of Trees in Washington County. I believe they're in the city of Hillsborough here. So I'll point out that if you're in Washington County, in Beaverton, Cedar Mills, Cedar Hills, Hillsborough, or Aloha, They are actively recruiting property owners for, I believe, both street trees and private property trees. And so if you go to friendsofTrees.org/get-a-tree, you can sign up and be on the list for fall to get figuring out where and how and what to get planted in your yard, in front of your yard, something like that. So tree planting is one side of the equation that leads to canopy. A lot of the studies, a lot of the scientific work about the environmental and health benefits of trees is ultimately leads down to canopy coverage. That seems to be the main metric that we're using nowadays. Not the only metric. I thought about getting deeper into that, but I think we'll hold off on that for a little bit. But so Hillsborough recently had a canopy study done. And so I think we often focus on sort of the end result of it boiled down to somewhere around 18 or 19% canopy coverage in the city of Hillsborough. And as you can see in the report, it compares that to a bunch of cities that have higher canopy coverage, I think sort of nudging along the idea of like, hey, we need to increase this. We should be higher than 18%. But I'm more focused on than that overall number by looking at the picture on the left here and looking at the diversity, the heterogeneity across the community and thinking that, hey, that 44 looks pretty good. There's a whole bunch of areas in here that don't look as good. Where would we focus? How would we figure out how to do this planting? And trying to get some of these numbers boosted up. But that's only one side of the equation for canopy. You need to be thinking both about planting and about preserving existing trees. And so ordinances are mostly about preserving existing trees. And so I believe this is the first Instagram post ever by tree keepers of Washington County. Hard to look at these trees turned logs, isn't it? We at Tree Keepers of Washington County are aiming to keep them upright and growing. Join us. And so what I often see is we go sort of straight from, hey, we want to preserve more existing trees, to we need an ordinance. Let's find an ordinance, let's write an ordinance, let's do something. And that I'm hoping to give a little perspective of that's difficult, that there's a lot of choices to make, that community involvement is key, and that I'm not here to tell you what yours should or should not be or what you should advocate for. I'm here to tell you that they're very different from one another. And just in understanding that and understanding a little bit more about them, hopefully that allows you to sort of take the next step here if that's what you're planning on doing. So I'm going to show a lot of things like this where I'm not intending you to read all of this or any of it really. Just ordinances are about a lot of text, and I can't make a presentation without having a bunch of text up there. So it is what it is. When I think about ordinances, the first thing I do is I sort of scan quickly through them and look for these 5 highlights, right? I'm going to be looking at which street trees are protected, which private property trees are protected with no construction plan, what might be the mitigation for that, what on private property is going to be protected when construction is involved, and what might the mitigation be for that. On some cities, I fill these out a lot, and you can see lots of different things in here. You'll see in Washington County that's maybe not quite, it's not quite as complicated, that there isn't sort of, anyways, we'll see about that. So for Hillsborough, what I would say, based on my quick skimming of the ordinance, having done a couple projects there, all street trees appear to be protected. No trees on private property are protected if there is no construction. You can remove a tree in your backyard. If you're not planning on doing construction or anything like that, you don't need to talk to the city about it. But if you're doing construction, then you need to turn in an arborist report or show a construction plan showing the location of all the 8-inch diameter deciduous trees and all the 30-foot tall conifers. I always have a little bit of problem with this because there are deciduous conifers, there are evergreen broadleafs, so there's some things that slip through the cracks here, but I promise not to get too lost in the details on this presentation today. And that we have a mitigation of, if for every one of those trees that you remove, you need to plant another one. There's some requirements. There's lots of other things to know about this ordinance, but that this is sort of my first pass of what I look at it. And we might compare that to somewhere like Tualatin. I'll take a moment here to pause and say that just knowing who I'm talking to, glancing a little bit the list here, just guessing as to what the audience is, there's probably people who know way more than me about any one of these specific things. I'm trying to use my breadth of knowledge to be helpful rather than my details of any one of these particular things, if that makes sense. So City of Tualatin, again, protects all street trees and seems to not differentiate between construction and non-construction. If you're going to remove trees that are 8 inches and greater in diameter, you need a permit. The exceptions of this seem to be quite extreme, where you can remove, I believe, 3 or 4 trees on private property a year without a permit if you're not doing construction, right? And so anyways, there's lots more details to worry about here, but 8-inch trees seems to be what they're looking for. And as Mary Lou pointed out, Washington County, I'm going to put all dash marks essentially unprotected. That's not, there are some details to know about Washington County, but for the most part, that's, we're going to say unprotected this time. We're going to pause for a second here. Fran's going to say something, and are any of these comments things we want to address right now, or do we want to leave them for the end, or what's going on, Fran?
Go
I
ahead.
think, yeah, I'm going to give you a chance to read these things while I make my comment here. One of our big problems is this mitigation of 1-to-1 for starters. So we know that a mature tree is like 70 times as effective in all of its benefits than a sapling because of die-off and lots of other things. So a 1-to-1 seems like a very poor choice. It's, you know, hardly anything compared to what's going on. The other thing is that I love this thing that Tualatin is just, you know, black and white in terms of very clear and objective, easy to follow. But we do have a great deal of problem right now with so much impending construction forthcoming. A lot of current property owners are choosing to do a clear cut in anticipation, you know, speculation. And they'll do that before, for instance, on Cooper Mountain, before Beaverton gets a chance to enact their tree code, which is much stricter about all this stuff. So these are our big concerns here. And I think you've done a good job here of giving these simple 3 categories for us to look at. It's good idea.
And then to add to that, there's a comment from Sarah Lee about exactly the Washington County, that the capital improvements without planting the trees, so to save money on different projects. And Sarah Lee, maybe you want to elaborate on your comment at this point.
Yeah, I think what just to summarize it, the ESEE, which is an economic study of environment and impact, et cetera. For Washington County, it says all infrastructure is totally exempt. And even dense urban development is also, any conflicts are also exempt. That was their decision with, we haven't seen the numbers behind it, but that's what we're concerned about.
Anything you want me to respond to or on these comments? I'm
The question from
I was
Mark,
busy listening to Fran, so I didn't read these very well. Yeah.
no worries. And I mean, one is a comment, and the other question from Mark is how you know, to avoid the Washington County cut the corners involves new roads, and how do we bring tree protection into an issue such as this one?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. So I don't know the best processes to go as an advocate to create an ordinance, and I'll get into this a little bit in a minute here. I think that understanding, you know, asking for the ordinances that you all want and trying to get them implemented is a good idea. And then once they are implemented, once they do exist, if they're not being enforced, if they are you know, not being regulated, they're sort of not happening, then I think that I have more experience with that of what are our opportunities there. And but in terms of that step, I'm interested in having a little discussion with you all about that and seeing what you all think. Okay, so one thing I want to sort of introduce you to and maybe get you all excited about for anyone who hasn't seen this yet is Connecting Canopies, Portland, Vancouver Regional Urban Tree Policy and Program Report, a little bit of a mouthful. It basically just got released. It's been in draft form for a little while here, but July 12th, you can see is the date that I have here. And so this is going to be, I think, released in the next week or so. And I'll just show you a little bit around it. It's a really cool, useful, interesting report. And so what they've done is they have basically created a scorecard and looked at every jurisdiction in the greater Portland area and given it a score. We'll look at that a little bit here. But I think this map is maybe most useful for our purposes today, where green is sort of the highest policy score, or like the has a lot of things in place that Connecting Canopies is happy with, right? And that red as a city and red dashed as a county are areas where there isn't very much in place and that Connecting Canopies sort of hopes for improvement. And so I think that this report is a good starting place to start both congratulating and like working with the cities that get good scores and that you're happy with what they're doing, and with figuring out the right ways to try to work with those who have lower scores that you would like to boost them in certain ways. And so here is sort of their scorecard, and this is way too much information for us to absorb right now, but we can just see that Washington County essentially is the second one down after Portland. And it basically has no's and NA's all the way across this scorecard here. And that it's a huge population at 239,000 people. This affects a lot of people compared to, what's going on in Tigard and Beaverton and Hillsborough down at the bottom. We see a lot more yeses and sometimes across their scorecard here. And all three of those populations add up to about the same as Washington County. So this is a huge sort of data source and piece for you all to use to try to figure out where you want to effectively advocate in Washington County. Again, this has more information on it than we really need, but I'll just sort of highlight what I'm seeing here, which is that Forest Grove doing pretty well, and that maybe Connecting Canopies and you all and whoever's in these advocate roles want to reach out and publicize all the cool things Forest Grove is doing. I don't know. Hillsborough and Tigard are sort of next down the list, just trying to highlight those that I see in Washington County. We have Tualatin and Beaverton as sort of, a little bit further down the road. And then Washington County and Cornelius as sort of the lowest ranking ones here. So if we're thinking, what I've anticipated as your question might be, the idea of this presentation might be, I want my ordinance to be different. And so I'm going to step through not how to make your ordinance different, but to talk a little bit about my breadth of experience with ordinances, a little bit about some specific details in Washington County to try to give us spur on some ideas for you all to go from there. So we'll see how this goes. The first point I want to make about if you want your ordinance to be different is that ordinances are changing all the time. I'm sure several people on this call know this better than me, but the Cooper Mountain area, as I understand it, is an unincorporated area of Washington County, which is being incorporated into Beaverton. And Beaverton is developing tree preservation guidelines, essentially a tree ordinance that only applies to this single area that basically, as it gets incorporated, becomes the local law of this area. And so there is a meeting next week in which they're going to go over their draft plans and I believe have comment periods and all sorts of different things. Fran, you mentioned Cooper Mountain earlier. What do you want to tell us about this?
So important thing for everyone to know, actually it was instrumental in creating this, what we called an overlay, because Beaverton didn't know what they were allowed to do or not allowed to do. And we walked the properties with them, with property owners' permission, and identified these areas, especially like whether you see what they call the kink in the road, that area is not mapped according to metro mapping. The thing is that Washington County just issued their significant natural resource ordinance proposal, and they are not accepting Beaverton's mapping, inventory mapping, because it hasn't already been approved.
You just keep talking. I'm just going to go to my next slide and just keep talking. I don't need to talk about this slide.
Yeah, so it's very frustrating because what we're afraid of is all those trees and all that area will be clear cut in anticipation of Beaverton going to put the restrictions on. And we put that in our letter that this is a concern that the Washington County is not accepting the city's re-inventory of certain areas while it's still in Washington County jurisdiction.
Yeah, that's interesting. So my main point I was going to make here, and I'll continue with, and really appreciate you chiming in on all this, Fran, is that Washington County is looking at their significant natural resources and how they sort of code and map and manage all of that. The comment period for this just ended. I believe that they're proposing that these red areas on this little map are the areas that are going to be, significant natural resources. And those are the areas in which regulation occurs. And outside of that, there's essentially no regulation. So to say there is no regulation in Washington County, except for these significant natural resource areas, as I understand it. And if we're going to be commenting and suggesting and advocating for things, my only real suggestion is to really understand what is going on in them. We can just say, hey, I want you to protect more trees. I want you to, do something. But when we can make meaningful recommendations, right, where we say, hey, instead of 10-inch diameter trees, I want 6-inch diameter trees. Hey, instead of 1-to-1 mitigation ratios, I want 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 mitigation ratios, or a totally different system of doing this, or whatever it is. We need to understand these details pretty well, and it can be very, very complicated. Reading ordinances is hard. Navigating ordinances is hard. Like we just need to try to understand them to be able to comment them. And it sounds like Fran understands them better than me, so I'm just going to keep moving. I wanted to share how I see ordinances evolving. So just a quick step back. Did you want to chime in?
Wait, go back up. Where did you get this particular one from?
I could find it if I needed to.
Okay.
Someone sent it to me. I think Todd Prager sent it to me or someone.
Okay. That's one.
But essentially, it's on the Washington County
Wonderful.
website. There's like a 10-page document showing some of the details of the plan that they have in place at the moment that they're hoping to use.
Okay, I missed this one.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like, it's hard to get all of these details right, even if you're trying to stay on top of it. Okay, so taking a step back, we released these best management practices from the International Society of Arboriculture on trees and construction about a year ago. And I started getting requests all over the country to go and talk about these BMPs with arborists about how to use them. And so a funny result of that is when I go to Arizona and Texas, and I actually went to Kentucky twice, which seems crazy, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Washington, Oregon, California, I look up ordinances in those areas and I try to talk to people about what they're doing in developing their ordinances. And it's all over the place. Like the West Coast in general is further ahead, has more ordinances, more sort of complicated, complete ordinances than many other places, but that I see them sort of developing in a similar way. And maybe it's just because I'm so tied into construction, and maybe it's just I'm wrong, right? Of like I'm just one person's perspective. But what I see is people live in a place where they really love the trees around them, right? And then their neighbor moves in and cuts down a lot of trees to build their house. And they think, hey, I don't really like that, right? I wish that we could, I think a lot of trees came out that didn't need to. Maybe some trees stayed that should have been cut out, and that's even worse, right? If they cut off all the roots and we think the tree's going to fail in the next windstorm, we want some sort of protections. And so sometimes what I see is they don't even create a law. They don't even create an ordinance. The planning department starts asking for a tree protection plan as part of the construction process, where it's essentially in policy form. It's not a law. And then the city sort of says, hey, that seems like it's working well. We should codify it in a law. We're going to create an ordinance, right? But this ordinance only applies to protected, to trees that are going through construction. And as Fran just said, what then happens is private property owners say, hey, I don't need a permit to remove trees on my property. I'm going to go ahead and remove those trees today because I think in a few years I might build. And I see this loophole. And then the city recognizes that that's happening. And then they protect all the trees. And so it doesn't always go through at each one of these steps. It doesn't always end at this point. We don't know where we're going to end. We're going to keep evolving and changing over the course of time. But I think that this is what I see as I talk to people about their ordinances. I see them go through these little steps. And that, just like Fran said, I think that that's where we are in Washington County right now, is in this place where it's like, hey, some cities protect, some don't. Some protect just construction, some don't. And to some extent that's normal. But also this is just sort of where we are in our evolution. And I suspect we continue moving along this line of all trees protected. But I don't know. I don't know what to expect, but that's something that we might ask for, is to jump all the way to this far end. And that might be right for our communities and it might not. I think that most people don't like the idea of being told what they can and can't do with their private property. And so we have some history of this though, right? Like, I forget which city this was that I looked it up in, maybe Hillsborough, has a livestock regulation law, right? Of you can't have big, noisy, smelly animals on your property unless you follow these rules, right? There are noise regulations where you can't make this amount of noise without expecting your neighbors to complain. So there's this trade-off between private property rights pulling on one side and being a good neighbor on the other side. And how that applies to trees is that the benefits of trees don't apply to the private property owner. They apply to the community as a whole. And so this is an interesting new tool that I just discovered at the conference that Fran mentioned, where Nature Quant gives us a nature score. And I'm going to dig into the details of this. I haven't done it yet, but I just pulled up a random address in sort of downtownish Beaverton that has a score of 51.9. I think my house is like 68, something like that. And so it gives us a general idea of what sort of environmental and health benefits we're getting from the trees and nature around us. And I think that this bigger circle, I think the small circle is 100-meter radius, and the bigger circle is 500-meter radius. And if this is true, so I don't know the answer to this question of how much distance do we expect these benefits to apply? And I've been asking researchers this. I asked Joffrey Donovan this. I asked can't remember the person's name who made Nature Score. And that is a really interesting question to me and gets at the heart of tree ordinances, of why do we have them? And the answer is because the whole community is benefiting from these, not just the private property owners. So to some extent, we all own the rights of these trees a little bit, and that's what the reason why we protect trees on private property, protect them sort of at all. And so I think that that's what I have to say about this. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the sort of evolution of ordinances, right? Of like, why are they so different? How do they change over time? What's going on? Another feature that I see, another reason as to why they're so different from one another, depends on where urban forestry is located in the city structure. So in Beaverton, the urban forestry department is within public works, right? So trees are sort of considered to some extent infrastructure, sort of like a street light or a pipe carrying water, a sanitary sewer pipe or something like that. Whereas in Forest Grove, it's in the planning department. So it might be considered more like, when they do population studies and they do sort of bigger picture planning and growth and density projections and things like that. And then in Portland, it's in the Parks Department. So all three of these cities, based on where those organizations are laid out, you would sort of expect the ordinances and policies and different things to be different from one another. And then how did they develop over time to create these ordinances based on public meetings, based on who showed up to those public meetings and commented, who submitted written comments, who did they reach out to in the community, and who had the sort of loudest voice and were most sort of engaged in them and gave them the best ideas to sort of move these ideas forward. We would all expect these to be sort of these ordinances to develop differently, and that the way to create this momentum in Washington County, not at all clear to me, but I do know that they evolve differently in every community, and that how they can and should evolve in Washington County, super good and interesting question. I see quite a few people so hyper-focused on the ordinance, and that I want to warn you against that. I want to talk a little bit about, I see that sometimes not working out very well. And I'll tell you a little bit about the city of Milwaukee. I know it's not in Washington County, but I think it's a good example of a city that recently passed a quite complicated tree ordinance, and I think is doing a pretty good job in terms of building policy around it by saying, hey, one of the key features of this is to have a really accurate trunk diameter. And we want to make sure that everyone's measuring the trunk diameter in the same way and reliably. So here, let us tell you exactly how to measure the trunk diameter. And while not every detail is getting codified in the ordinance, it's having another document there to sort of help them, help us all figure out how to navigate this ordinance. Then they're communicating with the property owners. They're saying, hey, if you think you might need a permit, let's help you figure that out. Like, let's go through this. We have this new ordinance. I know it's complicated. I know it's hard. And I know that they didn't do a perfect job of this, because I had several clients who got their projects rejected and came to me saying, hey, I didn't even know this thing existed. They say I need a tree inventory and a tree preservation plan and an arborist report. And I was like, yeah, I know how to do all those things. And so they get all of this read back, and they come to me. And so there's this relationship between all of us in trying to get the community exactly what it needs. And so enforcement is probably the most important piece of, if you could convince Washington County to have an ordinance that there's no policy around, there's no enforcement for, there's no whatever, it doesn't do any good. And so trying to build up this whole thing together is probably what I would try to advocate for, right? So somebody turned in a construction application for the city of Milwaukee. The urban forester reviewed it, sent this back, said, hey, you're missing like 50 things. They send that to me. I can help them figure that out. Without that step, I often see that step sort of missing. And without that step, I really see a lot of struggles. Okay, I'm going to drink a little water, give people a chance to comment here, and then we're going to get a little bit more into how I read an ordinance. I think we're getting close to the end of my presentation.
Ryan, that report that you mentioned, connecting canopies, if that is out and you can send it to us, we can post it on our website. That will be for the benefit of everyone. That was one of the questions.
What I think I would recommend is I'll connect you all with Ted, who put it out. Maybe you already know Ted at DPAVE.
Yeah, Teresa. Yeah.
We saw today. We were online with him just before this.
Yeah, it's not available anywhere. They emailed me a Google Drive link and said I could share it, and I'm happy to do that, but I think it'd be better if we wait a week and make sure we get exactly what we need and whatever. All right, does Joanne want to jump in?
Joanne, you're muted.
Joanne, you have your hand raised and you are muted, and I'm going to keep going, but feel free to jump in when you're ready. So a little bit about how I read an ordinance, right? I told you it's important to go read them, to understand them, to whatever. I try to get the general structure, and I can't really describe how exactly I do this, so I'll just say I start by generally reading the purpose, and that I find quite a bit of I'm trying to read the essence of it. I'm trying to read between the lines. I'm trying to be like, hey, how much did they care about this when they wrote it? Where were they coming from when this one came out? And that often there's big important things in the purpose, like, so I'm going to compare Forest Grove and Tigert, just two random cities here. And so importantly in Tigert, it references an urban forestry manual. And I love it when it does this. So not everything can and should be in the ordinance. A bunch of other stuff is necessary. They wrote a manual. Lots of other cities do this. I think it's a really great idea. I like reading these manuals and trying to figure out what's going on and how they sort of work back and forth in between. Joanne, you are unmuted. You want to say something?
Okay. Oh, I wanted to just talk a little bit or see if you explain a little bit about Washington County and the lack of enforcement for their ordinances related to the SNR areas. Unfortunately, they really don't have any enforcement of not only just their ordinances, meaning that making sure that developers are abiding by them, except through Clean Water Services, which has limited resources, but also the mitigation happens, right? So the developer may enhance an area as mitigation and upland habitat when they're, developing and taking trees down in a habitat area. But there's no there's no enforcement, there's no monitoring of the mitigation. They're supposed to for 2 years, the developer is supposed to make sure that these trees and plantings that required of them to put in are thriving, and watered, but none of that happens. And a Clean Water Service person, project manager said, they're aware that the mitigation's kind of a joke, frankly, in the county, because there's no one they don't have the resources to do it. So to me, like you said, enforcement's so important, and yet we're in a urban unincorporated Washington County where we only have about 1,000 acres left of SNR area, maybe a little more, but and there's no enforcement. So anyway, I don't know, with these new ordinances they're putting out, there still doesn't appear to be resources for the county to provide that monitoring and checking. And so it's discouraging because, they'll put these ordinances out and then nobody's checking these. And we said, 2 years of watering these trees isn't going to be sufficient. The trees die, they're supposed to replant, doesn't happen. So you go to these areas that have been developed in the upland habitat and, that's been enhanced, all these saplings are dead. And yeah, so anyway, I just wanted to point that out. You mentioned earlier.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that comment. I think a lot of that I know is pretty far outside of the urban forestry realm that I'm trying to stay in and more into the habitat area, but what we can delve into that a little bit. Open invitation of, like I said, how should you create an ordinance? Pretty complicated. If somebody's not enforcing their ordinance and we need to hold their feet to the fire a little bit, I got ideas about that. So reach out to me individually about individual things if how we document and hold people's feet to the fire about that. I've seen that done before.
Okay, just a really quick comment though. If there's no enforcement in the ordinance, in other words, it's not even, they're not mentioning it really. Anyway, I can talk offline to you or check in with you about it. I'm curious, but go ahead.
Sounds great.
Okay.
So the next thing that I'm going to look for in the ordinance is what is a tree? And this might sound silly. And because I picked two random cities, it is a little silly of that. They don't, I know this is very small. They don't say anything all that interesting about it. It's a woody perennial. They have different details. Sometimes there's very important details in what is a tree. In these two, there happen to not really be anything. Next question I'll ask is, what is a protected tree? And this is what I got to on that other graphic. Where in Forest Grove, pretty good list here of street trees, natural resource vegetation, trees on developable land. Developable land is one of those phrases that I hone in on when I'm reading these. I'm like, cool, what does that mean exactly? And so you got to go to other definitions and do all sorts of different things. Trees on approved site plans and registered trees. Some communities call these heritage trees, trees that are sort of officially designated by the community. This is the sweet spot. This is what I'm really most interested in when I'm reading an ordinance, and then I'll also look at some of the other details. And then similar in Tigard, Tigard has a very strange approach. I don't know any other city that does this, but I expect to see more of this in the future about more of a canopy approach. But again, it references the urban forest plan, or the whatever that was called that we showed earlier, section 10, part 3, which says, hey, you got to show the trunk locations and drip lines of trees greater than 6 inches in diameter, and then a bunch of other things. And I'm like, okay, cool. That's what I'm going to include in my inventory. That's how I'm going to approach this project. The last one is the last two are a little bit hard to grasp, but really, really important of what is concrete and what is flexible. And I'll just show you one example, but it's there's a lot to it, I would say. So in Tigard, they've identified a hazard tree as using this system. So in tree risk assessment, do I have it right here? I don't know where it is. We typically we use this methodology that ends with a risk rating of low, moderate, high, or extreme. This one is referencing a 12-point system, which is the old system, but it's modified and made that its own. And so Tigard sort of essentially created its own tree risk methodology that it wants you to use and tells you that if it's an 8, 9, or 10, essentially a very risky tree, you're allowed to then classify it as a hazard. And you would absolutely need a certified arborist who has done this before to be able to do this. A layperson would have a lot of trouble doing it. And we can compare that to forest grove, which I think is more common, which says criteria for removing a tree if the tree is unsafe to the occupants of the property and adjacent property or the general public, essentially allowing us the flexibility, right? We can compare concrete of like numbers based on this system versus unsafe. And what does unsafe mean? And how do we quantify that? And what methodology should we use and whatever? Allows us quite a bit more flexibility to say, hey, this tree is unsafe in this situation, in this situation it's safe, whatever. So important to read ordinances in those ways. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of thoughts of what I hear from people. And I have no idea if you all are interested in this, but here we go. I hear people say, I want my neighbor too. And then red flags start going up when someone calls me and says, I want my neighbor too, because I'm not really interested in getting involved in a neighbor dispute, but they happen. And so commonly I hear, I want my neighbor to remove their tree. And one of the reasons for that is because it's a hazard tree, because I'm scared of it. Tigard and several other cities do have provisions where it says here, no responsible party shall allow to stand any hazard tree as defined, and then we have our definition again. And so you could hire an arborist to determine that your neighbor's tree is hazardous and force them to remove it. The city of Tigard goes way out of their way to say, please don't just like do this and force our hand. Talk to your neighbor, go to mediation, do all sorts of other things before you get there. That's all the same advice I would give you if you called me and said, hey, I want you to evaluate my neighbor's tree. I think it's a hazard. I'd be like, hey, have you talked to your neighbor yet? What else is going on? Maybe I don't want to be involved in this at all. So anyways, just a quick heads up about that. There are options. It is possible. Just don't escalate it to 100 right away. Maybe like bring them some brownies and talk to them about their tree first before you call me. I want my neighbor to not construct close to my tree. So this is something that often slips through the cracks. I always evaluate neighboring trees as to whether they're going to be impacted by the construction project that I'm working on. In the best management practices, it says, trees commonly grow across property lines. When it is likely that construction will impact a neighbor's tree crown or roots, the arborist should consider these trees in the resource evaluation / tree inventory. And when developing tree protection zones, neighbor-tree conflicts can potentially be avoided by considerate planning and guidance from the project arborist. If this is happening, Unincorporated Washington County, probably a difficult situation. But other places, if you submit comments to the city, you talk to your neighbor, you start doing different things, I would definitely say that, hey, I talked to an author of the ISA Best Management Practices. He said it's best practice to evaluate what's going on here. Can we do that? And that I think would be a good step forward. I'm happy to help you with that, but mostly, again, I try to stay out of neighbor disputes. But I'll show you an example of when I did get involved. City of Portland is planning on installing a sidewalk. So this is a big deal, as Fran mentioned earlier. Some communities that don't have sidewalks, as we install them, they lose a lot of trees, and they sort of are, it's a tough choice. Would we rather have sidewalks or trees in some situations? In some situations, we can have both. In some situations, we have to choose between one or the other. So I did a quick evaluation. I said, hey, I think this first yellow line is where the property line is. Based on what I've seen of your schematics, the sidewalk's going to go here somewhere. I think this is potentially really going to damage the tree. So my recommendations are to ask the city to locate the 2 Doug firs on their construction plans, right? Have civil engineers come out there and accurately survey the trunk locations, put them on the construction plans, and then ask a certified arborist at the Portland's Urban Forestry Department to assess the tree's likelihood of survival, because I know that there's very good arborists in the City of Portland Urban Forestry Department. I don't really want to be involved in this assessment. I want them to do it, and that should be part of installing this sidewalk. So I think that there's, again, lots of opportunities to do these sorts of things, and that is what I have prepared to talk about today. And I'm looking forward to some discussion, some questions. I can pull up some other stuff if any of that would be helpful. Here's all my contact information for anyone who wants to reach out and continue this conversation. But Lorette and Fran, what do you want to talk about? What do you want to do from here?
I just have a general curiosity question. Based on your experience, are you finding differences in terms of having ordinance and enforcing them, cities versus counties, or is it something specific to Washington County?
On average, I think counties are less responsive than cities. Yes, they're typically bigger. They typically have less centralized populations who can sort of build the sort of community support around things, and they probably attract people who don't want to be regulated like in a city. And that being said, I know counties that have the strongest regulations around, right? It's just on average, right? Of how each county and city actually handles it is very different from one another.
I see. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think Josie has a question. Josie?
Okay. It seems to me that if you tied fees to the lack of enforcement, so if you violate a very simple code that should be easy for people to follow, and that revenue went to the county, or it went to some really important, useful service that everybody wants. I think that would be a way to get your enforcement, is to have a fee if you don't do it right. And the fee would be to their benefit to collect.
Yeah, fees are very standard parts of this for violating the tree protection ordinance. And I think that there's often a lot of struggle around what should those fees be, where should they go in the government structure, and how does that all work? Generally speaking, people are not a big fan of fees and enforcement and stuff. This group might be a little different in that regard.
In terms of one other thing is about when you put in a development and you want to have trees saved there, is there any great examples of doing it so that the developer doesn't, lose their shirt, so that it's the trees are put in and yet it actually increases their value because the trees are left? Is there some sort of things, developers we can point to, or examples of where it's done very well?
Yeah, so Fran and I, and maybe others on this call, were just at the Oregon Community Trees Conference, where we talked about the slogan, whatever, was more trees, more housing, giving Oregonians both. And Eli was on a panel with me, who runs Red Splot Developing Company, and talked about how he approaches his projects. And he only works in the city of Portland, and that I think that there are plenty of good developers out there, but I have only worked on a handful of projects where the developer went beyond what was required by the local jurisdiction. Maybe other consulting arborists have done that more, but I am generally, when we have really good tree protection, when we're planting a whole lot of trees afterwards, it's been in places where that's required by the city, not in places where somebody just wanted to do it.
I was going to say that two things, Ryan. We are have a kind of a placeholder with the ODF, Oregon Department of Forestry, IRA grant application for an urban forester consultant for Washington County. He had hoped it was going to be full-time, but we didn't get our LUT together fast enough. But it would be helpful for us if you had some really good examples for an urban forester. I'm looking at the deliverable of an urban forestry manual and these other things, because as we implement this new ordinance, which happens to be significant natural resource, but it does cover trees that are in there. It'd be very helpful to have an urban forester to help implement the new policy. But if you have any ideas about what an urban forester position might look like, I'd love to see it offline. We could put it in our grant application, some of the things. And the other thing is that this was very helpful in terms of the tree part, because we missed a few things in our review of the whole SNR. It's like 275 pages.
So it's hard to give comprehensive comment on those things.
You have some really good ways of giving clear and objective statements that would cover things. Like Mary Lou is constantly looking at development issues and people calling tree keepers about somebody cut the limbs off of my tree because it was extending, all these neighbor issues. And if we had more of that clarification in the code, I think that we would resolve a lot of those right up front. So these were really good ideas what to look for. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on anything, let you know if I have time to comment on anything. I'll point out that there is at least one, maybe two of the ODF folks joined us today that have better expertise in that topic of what does an urban forester need in terms of qualifications and what should job responsibilities and things like that. I would say reach out to the ODF team first about that, because I think that one of ODF's goals is to support communities in sort of creating and implementing ordinances that make sense to their communities. And that's not the mission of my company. It's the mission of this organization. So they'd be the first one to reach out to.
Yeah,
and if either of you from ODF want to say anything, feel free to chime in.
I'm tagging Jennifer.
Yeah. Hey, Fran, I think what I'll do is I'll put some information on how to book with one of our community assistance foresters, and we can talk more about this then.
Hi, Jennifer. I got your email today. I look forward to chatting with you soon.
Yeah, we have a lot to catch up on.
Yep. All right, what are we thinking here? We've got another 15 minutes booked here. I haven't really done my job of reading through these comments.
We pretty much covered things that people posted, basically.
Great. Well, do we want to let people go a few minutes early? Looks like Green Heron Mark has something he wants to say.
I guess I'm still, curious what options are, I guess, how we can invoke trees into these larger scale unincorporated Washington County. I think of King City's Fisher Road extension. They've got 4 options, and the city chose the option that would definitely take down the most trees when they had alternatives. And then I think of when the developers Washington County with the Tile Flat Road extension, they just want to cut a corner, and it just seems like poor planning and not really a necessary move. do you just, is our only recourse just to kind of invoke the science behind, why we should hold on to trees? Is there, have you seen any other successful angles, we can take in situations like that specific to trees, or are we just kind of stuck because the developer is either a city or Washington County, and there's just nothing on the books right now?
I'm going to have a weird answer to that question, maybe. I think that this Connecting Canopies report has ammunition in it to approach policymakers and say, you guys scored a 0. We would like something. And what is the right ask is an interesting question. I provided to Teresa a critique of the point system, of that. I don't think anyone's out there trying to game the system to get a better score in the Connecting Canopies report card. But some of the things on the checklist are very easy to get, and some of them are very hard, and they have the same weight. And so if you brought that to them and said, we want you to do something, and they just said, cool, this one's easy, done, end of story, that would not be a very effective use of that report. But that I think that done correctly, advocated in the right way, the combination of the science, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around the numbers, and would be interesting. I need to sort of work my way through Jeffrey Donovan's math someday. And if his math is correct, we are undervaluing trees by hundreds of times, by like a huge amount. And that understanding that and being able to convey that and sort of try to and justify some different decisions based on that could be enormous. So I think two ideas there, right? Of Connecting Canopies report and some of the science that we talked about, in particular, that one paper looks mind-boggling, the numbers he came up with.
Okay, thank you.
Mary Lou?
I think that is an interesting way to go forward with that, because I've not seen that report, and it's very striking when you see certain parts of our county are 0, as you say. And I must say, Fran has given the county commissioners 3 years worth of science-backed data of the importance of trees. I mean, it's like, I don't know, those commissioners don't seem to care.
And we have a petition of like 500 signatures urging urban forester for this.
The only thing, the only hope, I think, I know the squeaky wheel sometimes gets attention, is perseverance here. Because I don't know, maybe they think we're just going to give up. And that's never not going to happen with our organization. And it's like every preliminary neighborhood meeting for development that I go to, I give my spiel. They see that I'm from Tree Keepers. They want to know, what am I doing here? Because I always bring up the trees. How many are you going to save? Oh, you're not saving any. Well, it's a lot of education on our part, giving it education to the community, and then it's perseverance to never give up on convincing the commissioners of the importance of some kind of tree protection. It's like, if we just start with baby steps, okay, but something, because right now in the unincorporated areas, there's nothing. And I think a lot of people don't know this until, something comes up in their neighborhood and they go, what? That developer can just chop down the whole forest? What? I mean, 12 years ago, that's what happened to me. And so that's how come I got involved. It's like, I just couldn't believe they could just chop down a whole forest.
Yeah, and I'll
So,
just share my experience, which may be very different than yours, which is I often get paid by developers to attend public meetings and speak about, I'll answer questions about how many trees are going to be removed, how we're going to protect the trees that are remaining, whatever the questions are. And I am quite amazed how often trees come up as an issue in public meetings and how often projects are on hold, go back to the drawing board, like things happen because of trees. I know that you're sort of, I'm hearing some frustration. And so I just want to let you know that, like, to me, like the bird stuff and the water stuff and whatever, like, I would think all of that would come up more often. But because I get invited to the contentious tree ones, maybe I have a little bias towards this. I'm really quite shocked of how passionate people are about trees, how important that part of the public meeting process tends to be, and how often it seems like it gets incorporated. Maybe not all as much as you want in your experience. Maybe Washington County is different. But anyways, just wanted to share that from a broader perspective.
I just wanted to mention that matrix that you saw from Connecting Canopies about the different capabilities in Washington County Land Use and Transportation in their National Resources assessment document had that same matrix. And they owned up to the fact that there was nothing across the board for Washington County. And the commissioners would not fund doing any of those things. So this was not news to us. Those of us who have been following this a long time about trees. The second
just thought
thing,
about, Fran, I
sorry?
just thought of one more thing, getting back to Mark's question, if you don't mind me jumping
Sure.
in.
Please.
Trees are what we're finding in urban forestry. I consider myself more of an arborist than an urban forester, and every once in a while I have to get into urban forestry world. What we find in urban forestry is that people are looking for trees to solve a lot of problems, and that they're bringing us in because they need our help in the biological realities of making that happen. And that if we can understand what's important to Washington County and our other entities that we're advocating for, and giving them solutions to those problems that involve trees, I think that might be another way, another approach to move the needle, to say, hey, so like my consulting practice is how I was trained as a consultant is largely around solving problems. So talking to someone, identifying a problem, bringing them a solution that almost always involves trees, right? That's a lot of what I do. That's another potential approach to consider. Take it away, Fran. Sorry for interrupting there, as that bumped into my head.
No, that's okay. One of the things that we were looking at when our response about the new ordinances was how do we provide more buildable land for developers? And, some of the things that were done in different cities, et cetera. But the other one about the connecting canopy. So the maps that you had, we are very fortunate to have Eric Butler as a GIS expert, and he has been doing some overlays. And I think with that new one that Connecting Canopies has yet to release, we can do the overlays of the heat islands and also from HHS, Health and Human Resources, some of the illness patterns. I think that would be something that we could take to the commissioners. I love Donovan's done some great work on the dollarizing the impacts of not having trees. So if we can do a return on investment, that might be another thing to help push the needle, as you said.
Well said.
So we haven't heard from, we have the same voices all the time. There are other people on this line. Anybody have any questions or suggestions or want to help in some way? Jim.
Ryan, you had said there were solutions, a couple of minutes ago. Can you give us some example of the solutions you proffer?
Yeah, so we'll start with some problems. So problems being, we're at the capacity of our stormwater system. We're going to need to spend millions or billions of dollars to upgrade our stormwater capabilities. What what other options are there to install green infrastructure to intercept some of that rain flow and other things so that we don't need to spend millions of dollars on pipes. I think schools are a great example. As one of you talked about, the amount of asphalt at schools and the like clear performance hits that happen because of that. So if whatever your county commissioners are most, is most keeping them up at night, it sounds like to some extent that that's housing. And that while we agree that housing and trees sometimes are in conflict with each other, they don't have to always be in conflict with one another. We can find ways around that. So what and I don't have any sort of solutions to how trees help more housing. But I think that there's all of those science that I mentioned of, hey, are we having, remnants of COVID affecting our communities where they're not gathering effectively, they're not exercising enough, the air is too polluted, whatever it is that we're struggling with, bringing trees as a solution to that, I think sometimes is a pretty obvious sell and sometimes is not so much. Did that help some, Jim?
A little bit, sure.
Ryan, it's Joanne.
Hi,
No,
Joanne.
I just, and following up on Jim's comment or question that Clean Water Services, are drainage issues in the county and the urban county because of obviously all the continued development, right, of, hardscape and, kind of the point can be made that, that'll come, all the infrastructure will show up in our sewer bills, right? So I like that analogy, if we could somehow figure out how to, trees take up so much water, right? And so much of our help drainage so much, and kind of making the point that to people, it's kind of an education piece, that, trees, I think here in our community, we have a lot of trees and people don't really understand that connection that one of the benefits is that they really take up a lot of the water that falls on the ground. Anyhow, it's just one piece of education I think that is missing for people. That's
Great,
all.
thanks. Mark, what are you thinking?
Oh, I was,
I was gonna say, I'm just curious. So, from your experience, obviously we can get in touch with tree keepers and set forth, turn them on to an issue or a situation, and bring their might to bear as an advocacy organization. What other organizations are you aware of out there, specifically advocacy that we could kind of do this same thing with? Bring an issue, say a specific issue, a specific project. And that you've seen some interest or willingness to take a stance or at least a position.
Yeah, I mean, I think Friends of Trees to some extent does some sort of education and advocacy. I think that DPAVE is a really interesting organization around some of these topics, not necessarily all of them. And then I'm on the Canopy Planning Committee. I don't know what to call it, something like that, for Trees for All. And that's another interesting organization that I've mentioned Tree Keepers of Washington County to them as a potential partner. Have you all heard from them? Do you ever work with them, Fran? Anyone else?
I started a dialogue with them when we first started up, but we never got closure. I mean, I think they were more interested in adding more trees to riverbanks and things like that to recover hold back the sediment, etc. at the time. So it would be really good to reach out again. I think.
Yeah, they're a good example of I work with several different agencies or nonprofits that traditionally have been very focused on native tree planting for watershed health, that are seemingly looking around and saying, hey, the urban forest flows into these areas.
Yep.
And our community lives in them. Maybe we need to broaden our focus to more of this traditional urban forestry space. and Trees for All is one of them. Columbia Sioux Watershed Council is another. Quite frankly, I think a lot of organizations are thinking about expanding their focus in this way and other ways. And so I think, yeah, connecting canopies is an interesting sort of like aggregate of the Intertwine Institute and several other organizations. So that should be plenty. I'm sure there's others out there and more sort of crossover, but should be plenty to get you started.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're running out of time at this point. I want to thank you, Ryan, for your presentation, and I hope we weren't too interrupting here, but we have a lot of passion for this topic. And I'm wondering from the group, based on some of the things that came up, everything from nature quant to other topics, does anybody have any interest in following up on any of these items that Ryan mentioned? Like for another webinar?
Sure.
Which thing? Jim? Jim, by the way, is the chair of our CCI, which is a countywide participation organization, our Significant Natural Resource Subcommittee.
Well, I guess I was wondering how it connects with climate change, and if we can get people to realize that trees are very important in that sense.
Yeah, I think ordinances traditionally aren't crafted sort of specifically with climate change in mind, but like often sort of fits into the purpose. And I'm not sure I see it in a lot of other ways beyond like street tree lists and sort of thinking about what the future urban forest is going to look like. For the most part, it's like, hey, we want to grow our urban forest as much as we can. We have limited budget, we're doing the best we can, right? It's a good question though, and I think more and more of those intersections are really interesting to dig into and figure out how to make that work and what people are doing successfully.
Josie?
Well, I just want to mention that, a lot of because of the wildfire issue, well, there's a lot of home hardening, and that means removing vegetation within 10 feet of your house completely, and so on. But anyway, I just think some good guidance around wildfire risk, so that people are not unnecessarily taking out trees. Anyway, that's all. Well, there's the home hardening stuff is going to get more serious.
Fran, excuse me, I'm relatively new to our organization, but I was just wondering, especially since we mentioned about water and resources, would it be useful to leverage clean water services to help us with the county? I know they do a lot of cleaning and servicing around. Can we tap into that resources? Would that be of help, or have you done that in the past?
Ryan, if you have any contacts, it would be very helpful. Remember that Clean Water Service, the Board of Commissioners from Washington County is also the board for Clean Water Services. So Clean Water Services is the guiding light for all the determination of riparian and upland and trees kind of stuff. So we're still held accountable to Board of Commissioners.
I see.
And the big driving force. Yeah, and the big driving force for Trees for All.
Right.
Clean Water Services sort of started and still plays a big role in that.
So if you have any contacts at Clean Water Services that might be able to help us, that would be great.
Yeah, I would need kind of a specific ask, but absolutely I have contacts there.
Thank you.
Right. If you're all done, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Ryan, again. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for joining me, and thanks for all that you're doing. It's so important to have these passionate groups out there, keeping everyone accountable and making the world a better place.
And then thank you for me personally, Ryan. Thanks for doing this.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, we'll hope to bump into you all soon out in the tree world somewhere.
Yep.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.